Hello viewers, and welcome to my new dedicated gaming channel. This is just a little introduction to tell you a bit more about me, my life growing up as a gamer, and the kind of things you can expect to see here. First things first, I'm not usually much of a talker, let alone a public speaker to an audience that spans the globe, so you probably won't get much in the way of things like let's play commentaries or forced humour. I'm not an actor, and I'm not here to play an exaggerated character to try and gain some level of internet fame. This is all just about being myself and having fun doing something I enjoy, and that is making videos about games. If anyone has followed me here from my older channel, then I must thank you for sticking with me. You will already know the general style I've used for my previous playthroughs, such as the Ace Combat series, where I've always strived to capture a cinematic feel, to try and maximise the presentation of a game's story. In some cases, this has led to a certain amount of editing to cut down on all the guff, such as in the Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword playthrough. I took this to its extreme with the movie adaptation, he says while making air quotes that you can't even see, of an unreleased Star Wars The Force Unleashed video and, of course, Ghostbusters the video game. Cue the annotation link. Thank you very much. But hey, maybe you like the idea of me prattling on about whatever game I'm playing. So if people want it, then maybe I will try a few things out. Feel free to add feedback and suggestions in the comments. And I feel really dirty having just said that. So, let's start with the obligatory origin story. I was born in 1985, but my first taste of gaming didn't really come until about 1990. I would watch and occasionally play on my cousin's Sega Master System and Nintendo Entertainment System, or, as we tend to call it on this side of the pond, the NES. A couple of my older brothers also had Amiga 500s, which were quite heavily used for gaming. I also had a couple of friends who owned their own Nintendos, so I can remember playing the likes of Duck Hunt, the Super Mario Bros. Trilogy, and also the NES port of the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles arcade game. But most of my memories are of the Amiga, including games such as Alien Breed, Lemmings, the original Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles game by Konami, which was ported very badly, and North and South, which featured an odd photographer bloke on the menu screen who would laugh rather perversely if you used the mouse to click on his arse. The first system I actually owned was an Atari XE computer, a hand-me-down from people, not sure who anymore. I'm pretty sure they were family members. All I can really remember about it is the slanted function keys along the top, and the fact that the games came on cassette tapes, which took forever to load. The only ones I can remember playing were Cops and Robbers, Spy Hunter, and some awful top-down racing game that took forever to load just the title screen. Really though, this was all just a preamble. It really began in late 1991 when I received my very first console, new from the store. It was the Sega Mega Drive, bundled with the then brand new Sonic the Hedgehog. The visuals, the music, and especially the pace, these were all far in excess of anything that I was used to. It took quite a while to adapt. Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin, and F-22 Interceptor soon followed. Though I don't think I actually had any input in choosing them. Now, you might have noticed that it was a Mega Drive 2 I showed earlier, which wasn't released until 1993. So obviously it isn't my original console. What happened is that I swapped consoles with one of my brothers, and this is the reason, a Mega CD too. Yes, I had one. Between Sonic CD, an enhanced port of Echo the Dolphin, and a 7-minute promotional feature on a Mean Machine Sega VHS tape, I was sold. Almost exactly a year later, I was incredibly fortunate to get a Super Nintendo bundled with Super Mario World very soon after launch. That put me in quite a small minority during that bitter 16-bit gaming war, a multi-formatter. Unfortunately, I no longer have the SNES. It was sold in 1997 for reasons I'll get into a tad bit later. However, while I owned and loved both consoles, the SNES was little more than a Mario box, though for that matter, the Mega Drive was little more than a Sonic box. There were a few other games of course, but Mario and Sonic were the beating heart. These were the days when the side-scrolling platform game was king, and that was basically all I ever played. Even those which weren't Mario or Sonic tended to follow the same formula, such as the brilliant Earthworm Jim. For that reason, there isn't actually too much for me to say about the 16-bit era, other than it being my proper introduction to video games. It was in 1995 where my horizons were finally expanded beyond this very narrow view. No, not by that. Yes, would you believe it, the Sega Saturn! I'm afraid I actually bought into a bit of brand loyalty back then and dismissed the PlayStation as little more than a pretender. Now, even today, I don't actually think the Saturn was that bad. I certainly never regretted owning one, and ultimately it took me out of my platforming bubble. At its peak, my collection included the likes of Sega Rally, Virtua Fighter 2, Sega Worldwide Soccer 97, Firestorm Thunderhawk 2, Nights into Dreams, Virtual Cop 2, Earthworm Jim 2, Theme Park, Sonic Jam, and more. Onwards then to... no, not that. The Nintendo 64! I can distinctly remember the very first time I played this. It was HMV in the Metro Centre, over a month before the console was actually released. It wasn't a special event or anything, Nintendo just had lots of Mario 64 booths in shops around the country. I queued up for a good long while, and despite initial concerns about the controller being a potentially lethal weapon, I was absolutely blown away by how comfortable it was. It's a bit of a cliche to say, but when I moved that analog stick, everything changed. It seemed like I had complete control over that crude collection of polygons representing Mario, like it was an extension of my body. It's also hard to understate just how impressive those graphics actually were in early 1997, especially for a console, with trilinear filtering for textures and even a crude form of anti-aliasing. Granted, the result was that many games looked very blurry, featuring low-resolution textures that was only compounded by the use of RF aerial cables or composite. But the smoothness was still more appealing to my eye than the extremely pixelated textures of the 32-bit counterparts. So despite having a SNES, it was actually on the N64 where I first experienced many of Nintendo's other franchises beyond Mario. Wave Race 64, Star Fox 64, known as Lilac Wars in Europe, The Legend of Zelda, F-Zero X. These were new experiences, and ever since I have had a certain fondness for Nintendo's first-party titles. The N64 was also the console with which I first played games by Rare, which takes me rather neatly to GoldenEye 007. The first FPS I ever owned, and setting me on a path that would eventually take me to Half-Life, Halo, and beyond. Another massive thing that the Nintendo 64 introduced to me and my friends was the fantastic 4-player frenzy. You might remember me saying that I sold my Super Nintendo. Well, that was the reason. Shortly after buying Mario Kart 64, I sold the SNES and almost all of my games in order to buy an extra 3 Nintendo 64 controllers. Perhaps that was ultimately a foolish decision, but I cannot deny that 4-player frenzy nights of Mario Kart, GoldenEye, and even some of the party games from Pokemon Stadium are some of my fondest memories from my early teens. Finally, we can move on to the PlayStation, or as you see here, my PS1. I actually did own an original grey PlayStation, but that's long gone. Sadly, it held the distinction of being the first console I ever owned which actually broke, and after a mere 3 years lifespan. Of course, my first generation Xbox 360 bought in late 2006 would blow that away, with 2 failures in the same time frame. The journey that finally took me to the PlayStation is almost entirely down to my older cousin Adrian, and that's Adrian who is a bloke by the way. While I went the Sega Saturn route, he chose the PlayStation. This actually started a bit of a fanboy war between us, the one and only time where I really was blinded by that kind of rubbish. But slowly, very slowly, I would eventually be won over, accepting the PlayStation as a true console. What really did it was surprisingly simple. Gran Turismo and role-playing games. Gran Turismo needs no introduction, but I'll give it one anyway. This was the first racing game I played that not only had a level of depth that was far beyond anything Sega ever released on the Saturn, or was simply beyond the N64's cartridges, It was also the first claiming to be a simulation, behaving very differently from all those arcade games. But RPGs, this is where I really owe my cousin a great deal. When I would sleep over, I would spend many hours just watching him play Final Fantasy VII, Breath of Fire 3, and later Xenogears. Games that completely changed the way I looked at gaming from then on. It wasn't the gameplay, I was only watching them after all, but that's all it took to capture my imagination. Such a detailed world and complex story was beyond anything I had ever experienced or even imagined in a game before. Its impact on my expectations for future games cannot be understated. Oh, and there was also a little game called Metal Gear Solid, of course. As much as I underestimated and dismissed it, the PlayStation was a console where I discovered games could be so much more than I had previously thought. And I suppose that's all there really is to say. I've always been a multi-format gamer and remain so to this day. Apart from the Super Nintendo, all of these consoles remain in my collection. From the Dreamcast and through to the Wii U, these systems have all been about evolving and refining my gaming as opposed to really revolutionising it. Given my older channel, I would probably be a bit remiss if I didn't say something about Ace Combat. I first played and completed the original Air Combat on my cousin's PlayStation back in 1997, a full year before actually owning the console. I also once tried the Ace Combat 2 demo. It was not until late 2002 that I actually bought an Ace Combat game for myself, which was Ace Combat 04 Distant Thunder for the PlayStation 2, and it just went from there. But I'd been playing flying games for a long time before that. I actually cut my teeth on the Amiga 500, which was eventually given to me by one of my brothers. Flight simulators like F-19 Stealth Fighter and F-15 Strike Eagle 2. Though the Amiga flight simulator I remember most fondly was called Birds of Prey by Electronic Arts. In 1996 I finally joined the PC Club, and with it came the likes of US Navy fighters, TFX, Comanche vs Werewolf, Super EF 2000, Jane's ATF Gold, Hind, F-22 ADF and Comanche 3, so I'm no stranger to actual sims. Although what was considered a sim in those days is quite different from what we call a sim now. It just so happens that these days I generally have more fun when I relax and play the more simple Ace Combat games, as opposed to micromanaging detailed avionics and systems like in DCS World, which just doesn't hold the same appeal for me that it used to. There you have it then. I hope you enjoyed this little introduction and got to know a little bit more about me and what gaming means to me. My priority is always going to be making videos that I want to, for my own enjoyment, but I do hope that you'll enjoy them as well. Cheers!